So, what's a shrink like me doing in a place like this? Software tools and resources for genetic genealogy. We've just looked at the first slide, which is my day-to-day work, and that's it there. And we'll be looking at these autosomal tools first, and then Y-DNA surname projects. And these are the autosomal DNA tools. The first one is the pedigree chart, and we have just talked about the importance of having your pedigree chart. So now we're up to date. The second tool that I use, and it really is something I swear by, and that's the shared centimorgan project, and the third, I believe it's the 2017 edition of the shared centimorgan project, and this is available from Blaine Bettinger's website, The Genetic Genealogist, and you can see the link down there. And what Blaine has done, he's actually taken 25,000 known relationships, and he has asked people to submit these known relationships to him. And what he's done is he's calculated the average and the range of DNA shared for a variety of different relationships, from parent to child, all the way down to fifth cousin twice removed. So there's about, I'd say there's probably about 40 different relationships of varying distance in this particular project. And he's put together this lovely chart which kind of summarizes the whole thing. Here's you here, there's your parents, there's an aunt and uncle, a first cousin once removed, second cousin twice removed, third cousin 3 times removed, and so on. All the way out to fifth cousin 3 times removed. So you can see here that there is an average. For first cousin, it's 874, but the range is 553 to 1,225. And the units they're using are centimorgans, and centimorgans are just the unit they use to quantify the amount of DNA you share. If you think of it as a centimeter, then you're not far off. So you have these chromosomes, and you have a 10 cm, 10 centimorgan segment. Think of it as a 10 centimeter segment, and it's the same kind of thing. So there's this chart initially. Very important when you're looking at your matches is to try to figure out where they sit in the tree in relation to you. And most importantly in this regard, is there a generation gap between you and your close matches? So are you on the same generational level, or is one of them the son of your first cousin, or could it be that you're the actual lower level and they're the higher level? Now I allow usually 30 years per generation, so if you find that you're 70 and your match is 40, then it's probable that you are at the upper generational level and they're at the lower generational level. So when we come to something, and I'll show you an example of that in a second. So this is one of the charts that they use, and you can see that Blaine has a variety of different relationships here, starting with parent-child, then there's first cousin, half first cousin once removed, half first cousin twice removed, and the average amount of DNA shared is quite high for a parent and child, 3,400, and it comes all the way down, 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 down. When you get to a second cousin once removed, it's about 123. So you are looking at a very, very broad range of amounts using this particular tool. And it also includes the minimum observed in this particular study of 25,000 people, and the maximum observed for a variety of different relationships. Now, I particularly like his histograms, his frequency histograms. Here you can see for an aunt or an uncle, or a nephew and a niece, the average is 1,750, which would be in this block here. So that's the average. And that's quite a nice bell-shaped curve, a nice normal distribution. There are some uncles that will share a lot more DNA than the average, and then there's a lot more that will share a lot less DNA than the average. And that's a very, very important point to make, is that there is an average, and on either side of it there is a range. And you have to be aware that there is a range. So for example, with a second cousin once removed, the average is 123 centimorgans. This particular cylindrical block here is 107 to 124, so the range, the medium average is going to be in there, and then you've got some on below average and some above average, and you can see that it's a little bit skewed towards this end now, so you're not getting that normal bell-shaped curve anymore. you're getting a little bit of a skew towards the higher values. But the important point to make is that there is an average and there is a range on either side of that. So for example, this column here, there's 22 people who are 243 centimorgans to 260. 240 I would normally associate with a second cousin, but some people at 240 can be a second cousin once removed. They're just sharing an abnormally high amount of DNA for that type of relationship. So these are very, very useful to give you an idea of what are the chances, for example, if someone has you share 240 centimorgans with someone, what are the chances that it's a second cousin, and what are the chances that it's a second cousin once removed? And it gives you a much better idea of where you sit in the tree in relation to your match. In this particular example, and I think any match over 100 centimorgans is definitely worth exploring, because it's going to be relatively close. And for example, second cousin once removed means higher generational level. It'll be one of your great-grandparental couples, one of your great-grandparents. And on their side, it will be great-great-grandparents because they're a generation lower than you. So you see how you can now position where you sit in relation to each other in your family tree.
Yes. You're talking about total centimorgans.
Total centimorgans and not longest segment.
Okay,
yeah. And for this work that I do, I generally would only look at the segment length if I wanted to see if it was a true positive or a false positive. And that is going to be a problem for you guys if you have Maori or Polynesian ancestry, because there's so much endogamy in that particular population that there are some people that will have maybe 900 centimorgans shared with each other, but they will actually be quite distant cousins. How many people have Maori or Polynesian ancestry? So there's a few people there. So for those particular people, the fact that you've got Maori ancestry is going to make the relationship look closer than it actually is. And we see the same kind of thing in other endogamous populations, such as Ashkenazi Jews. Anybody have Ashkenazi Jewish? 1, 2, yeah? So again, you probably have thousands of matches on that particular side. Hindus, Romani Gypsies, Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses. So these are groups that tend to marry within themselves, within their own community, and that can mean that you become very heavily loaded with the same DNA going around the community, and it causes pedigree collapse, is what we call it, pedigree collapse. So you have to figure out then which is the great-grandparent, which is the great-great-grandparent. Knowing the age and assessing whether there is a generation gap is very important to positioning yourself relative to your match on the family tree. Now, I love the pedigree view in Ancestry. You'll have this in MyHeritage, you'll have this in any other, a lot of the software programs. And this is very similar to the pedigree chart that I showed at the very, very start of the talk. And I use this especially with adoptees, because with adoptees what you're trying to do is you're trying to break through a brick wall which starts at the level of their parents. And the way to break through that brick wall is you're hoping for very close matches to your adoptee. How many people work with adoptees? A few people. How many people have adoptees or illegitimacies or foundlings in their family tree at some point in time? Practically everybody. And I think it's a given at this stage that if you do a DNA test, you will be contacted by an adoptee at some point in time. And certainly that's been my experience, Michelle's experience as well. So it is a great way for adoptees to reconnect with birth family. But because they don't know anything about their family tree, they're relying on having close matches that triangulate on a particular family member in their matches family tree. So for example, here is a close match to an adoptee. This is the blue second cousin, but she also had a red second cousin match, and the blue and the red cousins also matched each other. So here's the red cousins family tree. And again, I put these in Pedigree View, and what you're looking for is common locations, common surnames, common individuals. Can anyone see any common individuals in these two family trees? Michael Rooney and Mary Walsh. So this adoptee was lucky enough to have two close second cousin matches who also matched each other at the second cousin level. And when we looked at their trees, we found that they shared these great-grandparents, Michael Rooney and Mary Walsh. The adoptee was also a second cousin in terms of the DNA she shared to these other two matches. And so we can conclude with a fair amount of certainty that the common great-grandparents for all three of these people are Michael Rooney and Mary Walsh. And what that means for the adoptee is that one of the grandchildren of this couple will either be the birth father or the birth mother. And that's how we do work with adoptees. That's the basic premise. And you can see here that the pedigree chart is a very, very important tool in this regard. Ideally, we want to identify all four sets of great-grandparents. And great-grandparents, for me, see, I'm born around about 1960s, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents. So second cousins for me would mean that we share sets of great-grandparents who would have been born around about 1870. Now that's very encouraging for me, because once I've positioned them in the tree, and once I know the date of their likely birth or approximate date of their birth, I'm able to say 1870. Okay, for Irish research, that's within the period of civil registration. They're going to be in the civil registration records. They're going to be 30 years old in the 1901 census and 40 years old in the 1911 census. And they'll have had children. So I should find them and their children in the 1901 and 1911 census. So knowing where you are positioned in the tree, where the common ancestor sits, helps direct and focus the genealogical research that you're going to have to do in order to identify the family of the adoptee. Similarly, if they were great-great-grandparents, I'd be back to 1835, which is beginning to be at the limit of Irish records. And if they were great-great-great-grandparents, I'm back to 1800. And the chances are starting to get much lower that I'm going to be able to connect the two trees like I have done here. You see? And even you can see in these family trees that we were quite lucky, because there are gaps the generation above. So we were lucky to actually connect these two family trees in the way that we did. So that's why I like working with second cousin matches or closer, because I know that I've got more records available for identifying the families. And ideally, we want to identify all four sets of great-grandparents, and that means, for the adoptee at least, having two second cousin matches for each set of great-grandparents. And that means 8 second cousin matches altogether, at least 2 of them, 2 pairs matching each other. And that would allow us to identify 4 sets of great-grandparents. And then the next step would be to trace the living descendants of these great-grandparents. So now we're tracing downwards. We're not going back anymore, we're tracing downwards towards living descendants. And it may be that instead of the couples being A, B, C, and D, that we reorder them into C, B, D, A, as you see here. And the implication, of course, is that one descendant of this couple here will marry in to one descendant of this couple here. So when you find the two families intersecting, that's when you have identified the grandparents, and the same for these ones over here. And this is a way of narrowing down the contenders for the adoptee's ancestors. The third step is to eliminate the non-contenders. It's easy to do if there's only 2 children in a family. It's much more difficult when you have 11 children in a family. And that happened to me recently. I thought, oh wow, you know, first you get the results back and it's like you have a first cousin match, a second cousin match, brilliant, okay, we're only a couple of weeks away from discovering who the birth father or the birth mother is. And then you realize that there's 11 children in the family. And then you have this nightmare scenario of having to approach each of these 11 families and saying, is it you? Can you do a DNA? Oh, is it you? Can you do, oh, is it you? Can you do a DNA test? Can you do a DNA test? And in the nightmare scenario, you would have to test all 11 of those families to see which of the children were half-siblings to the adoptee and which of the children were first cousins. And you'd get 10 sets of first cousins, and then finally, the half-siblings would emerge. So it can get very involved, and just when you're getting close, there's a fly in the ointment, there's a spanner in the works. Step 4, of course, is that once you have identified the likely people, and it's usually when you get down to the half-sibling first cousin level, you have to approach these people as delicately as you can with the news that it looks like you're either my half-siblings or my first cousins. Would you be willing to cooperate and do a DNA test? And that's where all your diplomacy and sensitivity skills come into play. And it's best done with the support of friends, family, a support network, maybe even a counselor or a social worker as well, because they have the expertise of dealing with these kind of cases on an ongoing basis. So that's the kind of approach that I take with adoptees. And in order to try to consolidate what usually is a huge amount of information into the one place, I simply use an Excel spreadsheet. How many people have used Excel? So quite a few people. How many people have just used spreadsheets that are not Excel? Okay, fine, so a few people. But it's, the Excel spreadsheet is actually a very, very useful tool. And it helps you summarize a huge amount of information, particularly the path to the common ancestor for multiple matches from different websites. So it might be Ancestry with this match, MyHeritage with this match, Family Tree DNA with this match, and you summarize it all on one page. And what it looks like is something like this. So here I have the average amount of DNA shared, and these are just averages taken from Blaine Bettinger's shared CM project. You can see half-siblings share 1,700, first cousins 880, second cousins 238, third cousins 79. This is really just an aide-memoir for me to kind of help remind me what the average is for these relationships. And based on that average, I'll be able to say that this first person here, AB, born about 1940, and notice I have the age in there, so you can see whether it's the same generational level or there's a generation gap. But AB, born about 1940, shares 107 centimorgans. That's somewhere between third cousin and second cousin once removed. Then we have another yellow match, EF, 161. That's slightly more than second cousin once removed, but a lot less than second cousin. And then GH, 122, which is more or less bang on the average you'd expect for second cousin once removed. So again, you're dealing with probabilities, and I'm thinking that the probability here for these yellow matches is that they're about second cousin once removed to the adoptee in question. The next step, of course, is to get hold of their family tree. And we all know how difficult it is to get hold of our match's family tree. Without the family tree, you're really in deep waters, because the DNA is telling you you're closely related, but unless you see who their ancestors are, you're not going to be able to connect them to your family tree. So having the family tree is absolutely essential. And I was able to get hold of the family tree for these three matches, and they all go back to Curtis, Phelan, and Marianne Warfield. Curtis, Marianne, Curtis, Marianne, Curtis, and Marianne. All of them go back. They're all triangulating on that distant couple. And because of that, I can relatively safely assume, and this is again based on the balance of probabilities, and there's a chance that I may be wrong, but the best fit, given the fact that all of these three matches are second cousins once removed, and they're born around about 1940, the adoptee is going to be somewhere around about here, a generation further up. And this now becomes my model for, it becomes my theory. This is the best fit model, can I now go on to prove that by looking for other evidence among my DNA matches? So you can see how important it is to have this kind of spreadsheet where all of this information is summarized just in one place, where you can eyeball it and you can put the whole thing together in your mind very easily. So the fact that I have these people's family tree also reveals that there were 3 sisters, Harriet, Sally, and Lillian, who did not have any descendants tested, and therefore their descendants become potential DNA testers. I can go on to Ancestry. I can look for people who have Curtis and Marianne in their family tree. I can see whether or not they are direct descendants of Curtis and Marianne by looking at their pedigree chart and placing them as the home person. And then I can approach them and ask them, have you done a DNA test? Because if they have done a DNA test and they're not matching my adoptee, then that's going to create problems. Why is that? Is that there's another adoption somewhere on their line? But also what I'm hoping for is that it will turn out that some of them are going to be second cousins or second cousins once removed, and eventually some of them will be half siblings. And we just narrow down the candidates until we get to the ones that are most likely to be the birth family of the adoptee. And that's great-grandparental couple number A, but of course we can do the same kind of approach for great-grandparents B, great-grandparents C, and great-grandparents D. And there's several other things that I use in this adoptee worksheet template, and I'll just show you on Excel. And the first tab I have is the action list, and this just allows me to keep track of what I'm actually doing. So you can use this with each of your ancestral lines, each of your brick walls, and it's just making a list of what you've done, what you have yet to do, and keep track of things as you do them. So they're simple questions that we should all be reminding ourselves of all the time, but we don't always do. So having them in a spreadsheet is quite useful. I also include basic info for the adoptees, such as they're putting a link to their tree on Ancestry, whatever they've been able to do, because some of them, of course, have discovered their birth mother's side of the family. So you can actually put a link to their tree on Ancestry if they have one. Then also the login details for each of the websites we talked about. Then I give some background information on the adoptee and the dated as well, so all the background relating to that particular case. Then I have a page which summarizes every single contact I have with the adoptee's matches. So I'll put the name there, the present location, their family tree to the match, the common ancestor of the match, if there is one, the possible relationship based on the total CMs shared, and then some information on when the person joined Ancestry, for example, when they last signed in, how old they are is very important to see if they're on the same generational level or if there's a generational gap. The number of people they have in their tree. It gives you an indication of how avid genealogists they happen to be. So, for example, the person that has 4 people in their tree, they won't have been doing genealogy for very long. The person that has 2,988, they're a seasoned genealogist who've probably been practicing for 10 to 20 years. Then I actually use the notes and comments section to actually put in, to copy and paste the emails or the messages from each of these correspondents and the dates that each of them happened. And in that way, you've got every single message that you've sent to every single match in one place that you can access quickly and easily without too much trouble. And then lastly, the page we've just seen, I put the pathway from each of the match up to the most common recent ancestor for each of your matches. So you can do this with your matches. This is how I do it with adoptees, but the same kind of technique can be used for your matches as well. And that simply allows you to keep a track of everything that you want to do for a specific set of great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents, wherever your brick wall happens to be. Of course, added into this, if you have also tested cousins within your family tree, then that also helps you focus on a specific ancestral couple. And that can be a very, very useful way of tackling the list of matches that you have. Now, comparing the various websites, and I haven't put up my heritage, but these are a variety of different tools for managing your matches. And I've kind of summarized it into this table here. And because this is going up on YouTube, you'll be able to stop the video at this point in time and look at this more closely, should you wish. But each of the companies allows you to contact your matches, gives you access to the matches tree, gives you ancestral surnames, gives you the amount of DNA you share with each of your shared matches. Only 23andMe and GEDmatch allow you to switch perspective. So for example, if you've got three people who match each other, you're A, you've got two matches, B and C. You're looking at B and C from your perspective. But what happens if you actually step into C's shoes and look at A and B from C's perspective? And what happens if you step into B's shoes and look at the other two from B's perspective? That can be very, very useful. Because if I'm looking at two people, two matches who are second cousins to me, they could be brother and sister. They could be mother and father. They could be first cousins. They could be second cousins. I don't actually know how they are related to each other unless I can step into their shoes and look at the other two matches from their perspective. And GEDmatch is the only one that really allows you to do that with a great deal of ease. Ancestry and Family Tree DNA do not allow you to do that. You can also identify overlapping segment, identify triangulated groups on GEDmatch, look at the ethnic makeup of your shared matches, divide your matches into paternal and maternal buckets is only available on Family Tree DNA. XMatch is not available on Ancestry. The Who Matches Who matrix is available on Family Tree DNA. Chromosome Browser on Family Tree DNA, not available on Ancestry. Access to actual records, genealogical records, is only available via Ancestry. And access to non-DNA testers' family trees, only available on Ancestry. Because a lot of the time, if you match somebody and they've got a very limited tree, they may have gone back far enough that you can take their most distant known ancestor on the line that's of interest to you, search for that person on Ancestry, and find them in somebody else's tree who's gone back several more generations. And then you can see how you connect. So you can sidestep onto somebody's tree, and they may not necessarily have been DNA tested, but you can sidestep onto their tree and go back further along your ancestral line of interest that shows you where you connect to them. Which of these tools, these features, is the most useful in my day-to-day work? Having access to non-DNA testers' family trees. It's not even DNA. It's Ancestry's access to other people's family trees is more useful to me than any of the DNA tools. Secondly, having access to the records so I can check the family trees. And I can even build the family trees of my DNA matches who haven't started their family trees yet. Because they just got the test for Christmas and all they wanted to know was, am I more Irish than my sister? Which happens. I have 3 second cousins, all in Los Angeles. 3 brothers and sisters did the family tree test to find out who was more Irish than the other. That's Irish. That is very Irish. The paternal and maternal buckets, being able to separate your matches into, this is on my father's side, this is on my mother's side. Very, very useful. But only Family Tree DNA have that particular feature. The next one is the XMatch. And again, Family Tree DNA, 23andMe, and GEDmatch have that feature. In practice, it's not terribly useful, because, and it's even misleading, because a lot of the time when you see that you have an XMatch on Family Tree DNA, it actually is a very, very small segment on the X chromosome, and that is probably a false positive match. And that is misleading you into thinking that it's going to be only on certain ancestral lines, because the X chromosome is only passed down through certain ancestral lines. If you're a woman, you have 2 X chromosomes. If you're a man, you've got an X and a Y. If you're a man, you get the Y chromosome from your father. You get the X chromosome from your mother. So if you're a man and you have a substantial X match with somebody else, it has to be on your mother's side, because your father gave you the Y chromosome. So X matching can be very, very useful for men, but in practice, I don't have that many X matches that allow me to say, well, the match is definitely on my mother's side. I don't get excited about an X match unless it's longer than 20 centimorgans in length, preferably 25 centimorgans in length, because so many of them are false positive matches, and therefore they will mislead you. So just be careful about that. The only way that you'll find out how long the X segment is, if you're using family tree DNA, is to go to the chromosome browser and then hover over the segment, and it'll come up with information about how long that segment is. And then the last one that I find particularly useful is the GEDmatch option of switching perspectives, so you can determine how your 2 matches are related to each other. Are they brother and sister? Are they mother and son? Or are they second cousins? But that is what I find most useful in my day-to-day work with autosomal DNA. Now, here we have the matches on Ancestry. How many people have tested with Ancestry? Right, so quite a few people. And again, you get a list of matches. One of the things that has bugged me for a long time is the fact that they only have a single star. You can either click the star as a favorite or not, as the case may be. How many people here use it for differentiating between maternal and paternal sides? Okay, it's a few people. But just looking at these results, there are certain things that kind of jump out immediately. One of them is no family tree. Well, if you don't have a family tree, all that you're left with is we're close genetic cousins and we have no idea how we connect. Without a family tree, the DNA is useless. It's only telling you you connect with each other, but it doesn't tell you how. So that's immediately a spanner in the works. But if we click on one of these matches with no family tree, what you'll notice, there's 2 things you need to notice. First of all, there's this circle here with the I in it, and that tells you the amount of total DNA shared with your matches on Ancestry. That's how you actually find it. It can be very, very difficult to find, but that is where you actually go to find the total amount of DNA shared. The other thing is this thing down here, select a tree to preview. But this is one of the matches that had no family tree. So why is it telling us select a tree to preview? If we click on the button here, there is a tree in there. And if we click on the family tree, it shows us that we have this. So how come it says no family tree when in actual fact there is one? It's because no family tree does not mean no family tree. It means they haven't linked their DNA to their family tree. So that's what it means. It's actually very badly worded and it's very misleading. But no family tree does not mean no family tree. It means there's no linked tree to the DNA that you're looking at. Now, there's several things to be careful with here. First thing is that if there is a family tree available but it's not linked to the DNA, I assume, and 80% of the time I'm right, that the home person in that family tree is in fact the person who did the DNA test. But 20% of the time, you'll be wrong. For example, recently, I was working on an adoptee's family tree, found one of these trees, assumed that the home person was the person who did the DNA test. I went crazy trying to figure out where the connection was, because I couldn't see where my Irish adoptee connected to these US colonial family trees. And then I messaged the person, and they said, no, that's my family tree. The person who did the DNA test was my husband. So I was looking at the wrong family tree, thank goodness, And as soon as I saw the husband's family tree, I thought, ah, that's where they connect. And I could see the connection immediately as soon as I saw the correct family tree. So you do have to be careful that if you're looking at a tree that isn't linked to the DNA, it may be that the DNA does not reflect the home person in the non-linked tree. So that's one important thing. Now, one thing that I'm hoping that they'll introduce in due course is another button that allows you to differentiate between maternal and paternal. And that's all we need, is just a little button or a little circle that we can click on, and we can color it blue for boys or pink for girls, and it is able to tell you at a glance which of these matches are on your father's side of the family, which of these matches are on your mother's side of the family. And that's going to make life a whole lot easier. So this is something that people have suggested to Ancestry for quite some time. I believe that they will be introducing this at some point in the not too distant future. Let's hope in time for Christmas. And that will certainly make life a lot easier. You'll be able to separate your matches into paternal and maternal. Now, in the meantime, you can use this tool. And this is MedBetter. It is MedBetter DNA, rather. This only works on Google Chrome. So you need to go to Google Chrome, do a search for MedBetter DNA, and what this actually allows you to do is to launch your notes section. That's the most important part of it, is that it allows you to make these notes that you can do on Ancestry, make them obvious all the time. So currently, you'd have to go into the notes section one by one, but this one actually allows, this MedBetter DNA extension allows you to demonstrate what each of the notes are by putting it beside the person's name. And you can see here that I've been able to divide these matches into paternal, maternal, 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 paternal. And again, it's another way of helping you separate your matches into two parts. I could take this even further, and I could say who the common ancestor is for each of these matches. So, and there's other things that you can put on there. The last time you messaged them, or if they're an adoptee, or whatever you want to do, you can actually make these notes apparent as soon as you launch your Ancestry Matches page. So that's quite a useful tool, and it helps fill the gap left by not having the blue button or the blue circle and the red circle to tell you whether it's paternal or maternal. Now, I mentioned triangulation earlier on, and this is an extremely useful tool for breaking through brick walls. So up till now, we've just discussed how to organize yourself, how to position yourself on the tree, but this is a very, very useful tool that has helped me break through several brick walls in my family tree. And it employs triangulation. And triangulation has been around for an awfully long time. Here you see people in the Middle Ages on the side of a bank, and they have aligned themselves. This is the base of the triangle. They are trying to figure out how far away is that tree in the distance. And we're doing exactly the same thing with genealogy. Here we are standing in the present, and we're using our DNA to see how far back a distant ancestor is. And triangulation has been used in trigonometry and geometry for the millennia, and it just involves these people standing here in the present looking back into the past. And I've used it very successfully in my family tree. Here's me here. This is my father's side of the family here. This is my mother's side here. You can see these are my siblings. This is my dad here. And he is descended from Patrick Spearin and Mary Morgan as the most distant common ancestors on that particular line. That was my brick wall. And over a couple of years, we also tested several of his cousins. And they all descended from Patrick Spearin and Mary Morgan. You can see the nice triangles that we're making when we go back. And all we're doing is we're taking cousins in the present and triangulating on a distant ancestor in the past. So I discovered, now the theory here, of course, is that these people we have a known relationship. But any matches that they share in common with each other the DNA has had to come down via Patrick Spearin or Mary Morgan. It could either be on the Spearin side of the family, or it could be on the Morgan side of the family. We don't actually know. So what I did was I just compared all 4 cousins together. We call them A, B, C, D. I compared A with B, A with C, A with D, B with C, B with D, C with D. So all the pairwise combinations. And I see how many matches are shared between any of these pairs. And there were 53 shared between Dad and Cormac, 17 between A and C, 13 between A and D, 34, 15, 22. I put them all into a spreadsheet, removed all the duplicates, and I was left with 100 matches that were shared by at least 2 of the 4 cousins who had a known connection to the most recent common ancestors, Patrick Spearin and Mary Morgan. So I wrote 100 individual emails with the simple question, do you have any Spearin matches? Or do you have any Spearin ancestors? Do you have any Morgan ancestors? And I got 49 responses. Cut a long story short, one of the people that responded had Professor Wardell's notebooks from 1906. Professor Wardell went to the Public Record Office and consulted all the wills, all the documents that went up in smoke in 1922 in the Great Fire of the Public Record Office, where we lost 800 years of Irish history in the space of a couple of seconds. But he had access to all those primary sources. He was doing a study of the Morgan surname in Ireland, so a one-name study, back in the early 1900s, and now I had got in touch with somebody who had the notebooks of all the notes he made down from those primary sources. This was as good as I was going to get. And here you see one of his notebooks. There's Mary Morgan and Patrick Spearin. There they are there, Patrick Spearin of Kappa, Ballingarry, County Limerick. That was the first time I knew where he was born. I had no idea about his birth, so that was already a great result. Mary Morgan became RC. So she became Roman Catholic. She had been Church of Ireland. So again, some really useful information about my particular brick wall ancestors. But not only that, it pushed me back an extra generation, Edward Morgan and Jane Dwyer on my side of the family. But also in the book, it pushed me back an extra 5 generations to Limerick in the early 1600s. And not only that, there's a link to Wales, where I go back to Sir William Morgan, who was born in 1571 and who was knighted. And his family tree goes back to 5 kings, 6 lords, and a duck, probably a duke. And beyond that, I even found a pedigree when I was in Salt Lake City last year in the Family History Library. I found a pedigree that went all the way back to Noah.
Must be true.
So it must be true. The more interesting thing, because obviously, you know, there's an element of fantasy now coming into the whole family tree, and all of this data will need to be double-checked as much as I possibly can in the present day with the loss of all those records. I still need to double-check the data. But more interesting is the fact that Sir William Morgan, who was born in 1571, had several very interesting relatives / descendants to whom I am therefore genetically related. They were Captain Morgan, who does the rum, Sir Henry Morgan, Governor of Jamaica, J.P. Morgan of Morgan Chase, and lastly, Princess Diana. I am apparently her 11th cousin or thereabouts, and I'm related to her on her mother's side of the family. So this particular example of triangulation, breaking through a brick wall, didn't just take me back an extra generation. It took me back to Noah and took me sideways to Captain Morgan, J.P. Morgan, and Princess Diana. So this was more than I could have ever hoped for. And it's a great way of actually focusing on a particular ancestor of interest to you. Test 3 or 4 cousins who are descended from that ancestor and who are most distantly related to each other, so preferably second cousins. That would be a good place to start. And triangulate back on that most recent common ancestor, and hopefully, if you write to 100 people, one of them will have Professor Wardell's notebooks, or the family Bible, or the letters in the attic that your ancestors wrote home to Ireland and they're still there. So that's what triangulation can actually help you achieve. It can actually shortcut you to the source of the genealogical information that will actually help you go back an extra couple of generations on a particular ancestral line. And how many times do you need to be lucky? Just the once. So that's why I'm very happy to write to 100 people, because I only need one of them to write back with the right answer. Now, there's a lot of information on the internet, on various blogs that are completely devoted to triangulation. So we have Segmentology by Jim Barrett. We also have, he's written some very comprehensive how-to instructions on how to go about triangulating. So do look up Segmentology on Google. There's also a variety of tools that you can look at for things like the overlapping segment mapper by Kitty Cooper, and Kitty has done a lot of tools in this regard. Up till now, there's been a lot of talk about overlapping segments, because one of the problems with the triangulation that I showed you initially, when I wrote to these 100 people, if I do get a match to these people, I'm assuming it's only via Patrick Spearin and Mary Morgan. But there's also the chance of a second connection. How many people have cousins marrying cousins in their family tree? Yes. So you've got second connections in your family. And that double connection could really throw a spanner in the works. And it kind of bugged people for a long time. How can we be sure that the DNA came from the couple that we're looking at and not from some other couple that is a second connection within our respective family trees? And one way around that is to look at overlapping segments. But the problem with that was nicely illustrated in a blog post by Ann Turner, who showed that if you look just at those shared matches that have overlapping segments, you actually reduce the number of matches to contact by a considerable amount. And that is the link to the blog there. And this purist approach ignores many potential matches, and in effect it's like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So that's why I'm personally not that much in favor of looking at the overlapping segment purist approach to triangulation. I think the messy approach, where you just look at how many shared matches are shared by any two of the four cousins, let's write to all of them and just ask a simple genealogical question. Do you have any Spearin ancestors? Do you have any Morgan ancestors? And it's the 51st response that will come back with the family Bible or Professor Wardell's notebooks. It also saves you a lot of time, because I think you can get very, very heavily ingrained in the technicalities of DNA, and I think that's a waste of time. I think it's diverting your resources onto something that may not necessarily produce a huge amount of return for the investment of your time and energy. So I like to keep things simple. I think you can get into this if you want to, and it may be helpful for certain ancestral lines, but I wouldn't do it as a blanket. I wouldn't use it as a blanket tool for every single ancestral line in your family tree. Having said that, if you do want to get into the technicalities, it's probably better to use a piece of software such as Genome Mate Pro. Now, this has been on my I should really do this at some time list for quite some time, and maybe at some point I will get around to using Genome Mate Pro. How many people in the audience have actually used this piece of software? Michelle and one other person, Chris. Anybody else? No? Okay. You need to set time aside to do this, because the actual setup takes about 8 hours per kit, per DNA kit. So it's a huge amount of investment of time up front. The good news, and I use the word good advisedly, is that there is an instruction manual, which is 230 pages long, or thereabouts. So it is a huge amount of investment in time and energy. I think I might try using it at some stage in the not too distant future, but I'm not making any commitment. But this is probably the best piece of software to use if you really do want to organize your matches in this fashion. The various people that I've spoken to over the last couple of years, they all come back to Genome Mate Pro. So even though there is a huge amount of time necessary at the start of using this, once you do start using this, then you will be able to start separating between maternal and paternal and start allocating DNA segments to specific ancestors. And that means that anyone who shares that segment has to have come via that set of ancestors. So it can be very, very useful. I think it's going to become more useful in the future, actually, because with the exponential growth of DNA testing, we're looking at the moment at 18 million people in the DNA databases, but I'd say in 2.5 years' time, that's going to double to about 35 million people in the DNA databases. So this kind of software tool is probably going to come into its own once we have a huge number of people in the various databases, and once you have a lot of close matches, second cousin and even first cousin matches among the many thousand of matches that you get in your results. I'll talk briefly about false positives. I mentioned them earlier on. False positives are a hugely understudied phenomenon. Pile-up areas especially. They are easier to see on the ADSA spreadsheet. That stands for the Autosomal DNA Segment Analyzer. And this is what it looks like. And it's available from DNA GEDCOM. And these pile-up areas, we think that they're probably related to a very important part or segment of the DNA that is responsible for example, immunity, the production of antibodies. Everybody needs this type of DNA in their DNA makeup. And because everybody has it, it probably has been there for many, many thousands of years. And what we're seeing here, perhaps, is a particular segment on this chromosome where all these people match, and it confers immunity against influenza, for example. And that's why you see a huge number of people all matching on the same segment. Now, of course, if you saw this among your matches, you might think, wow, this is great. All of these people match each other. We therefore must have a fairly recent common ancestor. Well, you probably all do have a common ancestor because everybody did. Everybody in this room did. We all became anatomically modern humans 250,000 years ago in Africa. But this doesn't go back just a couple of hundred years. This probably goes back a couple of thousand years to a common ancestor. And therefore, if you are pursuing this and saying, oh, do you have any Corcorans in London in the 1800s? That's the wrong question, because this goes back thousands of years, and the Corcorans in the 1800s will have nothing to do with this particular segment. And we see this on a bigger spreadsheet, and I'll show that to you here. Here you can see, again, a group of people who have a segment overlapping. Here's another group with virtually the same segment overlapping, and there's a few more down here as well. One of the things that's notable about these overlapping segments, and you won't be able to see it here, but it's all 8.79, 8.79, 8.79, 8.79. It's exactly the same length for many, many, many of the people that have this particular segment shared amongst themselves. And that's also a clue that you might be looking at an artifact in the system or a false positive because of this pile-up area on the particular chromosome in question. This ADSA spreadsheet is like a mega chromosome browser. So on Family Tree DNA, we have a chromosome browser where you can put 5 people into the browser at any one time. The reason I like the ADSA spreadsheet so much is you can put all of your matches into the spreadsheet at the same time. So this goes on for pages and pages and pages, starting with chromosome 1, all the matches, all the overlapping segments you have with your matches on chromosome 1, chromosome 2, all the way down to chromosome 22, and then you've got the 2 X's as well, so it does the X chromosome too. So, and this will go on for about 13 or 14 pages, but it's a very, very useful way of actually having all of your matches on the one page. And when you see several matches having exactly the same segment, and it's not just 3 or 4 people overlapping, it's like 8 or 10 or 20. That is a signal that you're possibly looking at a false positive match, and it will mislead you if you pursue it. And we don't want to waste time doing these things because we're going to get more relevant matches as time goes on. So that concludes the section on autosomal DNA, and we're up to 5 minutes to 3 o'clock, so it's probably a good time to have a break. Don, what do you think?
Okay. How's everyone feel? Would you like to stand up and turn around?
Yeah? So how long would you like to have for a break, Don?
Penny? We got, we have a cup of tea now, or we'll wait till the end?
Oh, so
we won't have a cup of tea now because it's too tight up there. We'll have to move some chairs and have a shuffle so we can have a cup of tea. So stand up and turn around.
all right.
Your body.
Do you want a natural break? You can indeed. I'm just going to turn off the recording.
We have 1 hour
Left. Yeah. Grand. I'll run through Y DNA fairly quickly, and I'll just turn the recording. So